Deep listening.
βαθιά ακρόαση.
Deep listening.
گوش دادن عمیق.
Kipun tsitki.
Deep listening.
Kuuntele syvällisesti.
Deep listening, impact beyond words.
When you're really in the zone as a graphic facilitator, one thing that you can do is make connections within the conversation that are not obvious to the speakers. And this is possible because of your experience, also your level of listening, and also the fact that you are an outsider to the conversation. I feel like the times when we've used scribing to its greatest success is when we're finished with the conversation and everybody steps back from the board and looks at it and says, oh man, that's what we said. And so being able to present a model of this organizational issue that they can then use to communicate to other people. I mean, I really feel like we've done a good day's work when we're able to do that, when the client's able to look at the drawing that we've produced and understand their issue a lot better because it's been filtered and connected and interpreted by another listener.
Welcome to the Deep Listening Podcast, an impact beyond words. One of the 5 elements of deep listening is making meaning from listening to others. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Sarah and David, world-class experts in visual facilitation and scribing. They're based in London, but their business is global and they make impacts for individuals, teams and organisations to move from questions to answers in an organisational context.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören.
Deep listening.
The beginning of this story started nearly 20 years ago when David and Sarah met. Good evening and good morning, London. David, hello.
Hello, good morning. Good evening.
The story starts 20 years ago where you and Sarah met. Talk us through that.
Well, we were both working for a large consulting organization, the management consultancy, that was in the midst of trying to find new and novel approaches to help their clients solve complex problems. So the big problem at the time was this thing that was known as Y2K, year 2000. You might remember it. Planes were going to fall out of the sky and everything was going to basically go wrong with the planet. What this consulting organization found was a small but perfectly formed a bunch of people in Southern California who had created an approach based on design thinking to help groups come together and work through, for example, the difficulties of understanding complex systems like an IT system that might have faults in every nook and cranny that would result in something terrible happening. So we basically met as a consequence of this new team being formed around large-scale facilitated sessions to help these clients essentially solve complex problems. I think, Sarah, were you in the US when this started and I was in London? How did that happen?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I had graduated with a performing arts degree, and when I got out of school and needed a job, and a friend of mine who was an artist had started doing freelance work for this large consulting company. She was an art grad, and they had just started bringing in people to do graphic facilitation. And she thought, oh, well, Sarah, you'd be great at this, so why don't you give it a go? And so I did, and never looked back, really. Started learning how to do graphic facilitation as a skill, which I added to my repertoire of other skills used on these design and problem-solving events, and that brought me to London, where I kind of never left. So that's the story of us.
So just for those who've never been part of a graphical facilitated session where a graphical scribe takes moments out of various multiple dialogues that happen, just put us in a room and describe what actually happens over a period of an hour, half a day, multiple days in some cases. What's actually taking place? Take our listeners into that space and draw a picture.
Well, the primary function of a graphic facilitator is to create a visual map of a conversation usually a large group conversation, although we have worked with groups as small as 8, all the way up to groups the size of 700, or even a large group plus an online audience. So the size of the group is really limitless. But the reason you're there is to make a map of this conversation. And that is to support the visual thinkers in the room, and also to support the overall conversation, because we believe that if you're taking notes while you're listening to a conversation, you're really not doing the most effective listening that you could. So what we want our participants to do is to sit there and focus on the task at hand, on the conversation, and let the scribes take care of the work. So what the scribe does is listen with intent. We're listening to the conversation. We're writing down what we're hearing. We're making visuals out of what we hear. So we're making rapid connections in our brain to an image, perhaps, or a model. We're also trying our best to make connections between as we're going along, what's being said. So connecting the ideas. Hopefully, if you're really good, you can do this visually. Sometimes you have to just write the words down and then go back to it. But you're making connections to the words and the ideas. And you're also listening out for what's unsaid. Part of what makes us successful at doing that is that typically we have expertise across a broad range of client issues, but we're not really involved in the issues ourselves. So we're like a separate third party. And that's what allows us to listen for all this other stuff that's going on beneath the surface. We're outside of it, which is what allows us to listen on this other level.
I love how you explore what's unsaid in the fourth level of listening is listening to what's unsaid. Easy to do in an individual and 1 or 2 person situation, but much more complex in a system of 7, 10, 12, up to 700 people. What I'm curious about is you have to stay in concentration for a really extended period of time. So how do you prepare for a full day session and get ready to listen to rooms of hundreds and hundreds of people sometimes?
First, you'd prepare in a couple of different ways. Typically, you'd have a content briefing from the main sponsor of the event. If it's one of our design events, we've been involved in the design and shaping of the event from the moment the client contacted us with whatever problem they wanted to solve. Sometimes they'll tell us about the personalities in the room. I always like to ask questions about the company culture to find out, is this a corporate culture that people feel free to ask questions and to speak out? You kind of want to get to know the people in the room and how they are likely to ask questions and some of the things that they might be afraid to say. So you'll start out getting as much information as you can, although, to be honest, a lot of the stuff comes to you in the moment on the day. David, you have a different kind of experience when you're with clients.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I guess there are 2 theories to how you prepare physically, because I think that was part of the gist of your question was, how do you get mentally in the zone, as well as then physically prepared for standing, literally, for what could be 12 hours during the course of the day. There's very much a kind of preparedness that's required. So ensuring that you're fit and healthy is definitely mandatory if you're going to be sort of on top of your game. It is almost like being part of a piece of theatre and knowing that you will probably end up with the most famous back in the world in some instances, because people are just staring at your back a lot of the time. It can be quite daunting. And then in terms of the level of listening that I would be thinking about, so I may not necessarily be scribing as intensely as Sarah might, for example. My job typically is more at the front of the room, almost orchestrating or trying to orchestrate the conversation. So allowing or trying to bring people into a conversation at any one specific point in time based on the sort of energy that you're feeling in the room. And so in some respects, you're trying to help the scribe reach the parts that the scribe wants to reach, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
because the piece of work that the scribe is doing is at one point a mirror. So it's mirroring back the conversation that's taking place, but equally it's a portal.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Escuta profunda.
I'm curious, over a 12-hour day or even a 3-hour day or even a 1-hour session, it requires not just extraordinary concentration, and Sarah described this multidimensionality of you're scribing, you're listening, you're trying to make meaning, you're trying to bring out what's unsaid. No matter how fast they speak, they only ever speak at 125 to 150 words a minute, and yet you can think at between 400 and 900 words a minute. So there is an opportunity to drift off. And how do you have a set of disciplines around your mindset to stay in the dialogue for that period of time? What are the tips and tricks you could provide to our listeners to go, when you jump out and you are distracted, how do you get back in? Obviously, the first point is noticing. Once you've noticed, what do you do to come back in?
Well, I think about it like playing an instrument. I play the piano, and sometimes when I'm like really into a practice session, I don't really notice that I've been sitting there for 3 hours. And I think that's experience, and it's just the habits that you build up for yourself. But I was just remembering a time I was scribing a session, and it was for a Dutch client, and he was spending the beginning part of his session just sort of chit-chat, getting to know the room. And I was like, oh, man, he's not really saying anything. I'm just going to draw some landscape. And so I was drawing, little people on bicycles and little Dutch houses and little, canal and going down there. And then all of a sudden the speaker said, oh, and that's how we solve the problem, this seemingly insurmountable problem in our own workplace. And I was like, oh, no, I missed it. I missed the main part of this conversation. And I think the only thing to do is just, first of all, you can't show that you've missed it. So I sort of dialed back on the bicycles and the canal boats and everything. And you just really have to put your back into concentrating and listening. Like, surely he's going to give a hook. And most people do, because especially in the kind of world that we operate, there's a pattern to the speakers, which is to prepare you for what they're about to say. They'll say the thing and then they'll repeat it. And so luckily for me, this speaker did repeat how they solved this seemingly insurmountable problem. And I was able to get back into the conversation. But I also tell this story as a cautionary tale, because it really is easy to let yourself kind of slip and think, oh, this whatever they're saying isn't that important. It's just chit chat. And oftentimes, actually, there's something there that you need to be paying attention to. So for me, that was a big lesson.
A wonderful example of the lost listener coming into play there beautifully. David, for you, how do you stay focused and on game?
For me, it's about being curious. The good thing for us is that we're actually brought in, we're engaged by people to help them solve a problem. So I guess my objective always is to get people to solve that problem in the best way that they can, which isn't necessarily the most creative way. It just needs to be the best way that will work for that group or work for the organization. So my attitude going into that conversation is about being furiously curious and being able to hope or expect or wait for a nugget that's basically just going to materialize. I guess now 20 odd years in of doing this, I think I've just learned to be fairly intense in my listening and my expectation that there will be just something marvelous that someone will drop into a conversation. And it may be, again, that wild idea, but it may not. It may be something that's just naturally emerging with the group. But I just stay focused for that period of time. And if you go in with an open mind and you feel excited that some new possibility will emerge, but it's your job to fish it out, I think that's how personally I manage to stay concentrated.
Yeah, and a beautiful example, the opposite of the lost listener is the curious listener. So really, really good example there. I'm curious about the kinds of techniques that clients tend to use that don't make a difference, and then they call you. When people come to you, what's broken?
Well, so I guess from my perspective, and looking at this a little bit just broader than graphic recording, what we've witnessed over the last 20 years is that people are starting to understand the systemic nature of things. So whereas in the past, There were lots of different dynamics within organizations. For example, the CEO and the board were all powerful. They had all the answers. The degrees of complexity were just not there, or at least not understood. What we're seeing now is that if you're not a systems thinker, you can't operate. You have to think in terms of systems because everything is interconnected. And we've seen very clearly what happens when the system breaks down. Suddenly there are shocks coming from places that you never imagined a shock would come. So essentially that's a very big change in how organizations now understand they should resolve complex problems. The linearity has disappeared. So the idea of mapping out that system, as Sarah said right at the start of the discussion, that's increasingly important now. And the skill set to be able to do that is not a typical skill set that exists within organizations themselves. I think that's probably the most startling notion that I've seen. The other one is really then the appreciation of design and design thinking. Who would have thought that you could be applying design thinking to the range of problems that we've seen or we've been asked to help with at, for example, the World Economic Forum in Davos, where we're handed a number of different challenges.
When you're really in the zone as a graphic facilitator, one thing that you can do is make connections within the conversation that are not obvious to the speakers. And this is possible because of your experience, also your level of listening, and also the fact that you are an outsider to the conversation. And so I feel like the times when we've used scribing to its greatest success is not even obvious until we're finished with the conversation and everybody steps back from the board and looks at it and says, "Oh man, that's what we said. That's how it is. That's what we said." And so being able to present a model of this organizational issue that they can then use to communicate to other people. I really feel like we've done a good day's work when we're able to do that, when the client's able to look at the drawing that we've produced and understand their issue a lot better because it's been filtered and connected and interpreted by another listener.
If you think about the role of stories in that, you capture stories, you hear stories. Quite often in my work with clients, until they close off a previous chapter and give it credit or acknowledge the fact that it is a story from the past that's holding them back to the future, it's really difficult for the team, the people, the organisation to step forward. To what extent are you capturing both the past and the present and the future in these amazing maps and models that you're creating for these clients?
I think just going back to the idea of the mirror and the portal, I think there's a very strong element of that. Sometimes there's a lot of baggage that needs to come out in order for a group of people to be able to move on. For example, if there's a history of failure for, getting projects done, for example, that can have a lot of scarring to it. Or when we do our work in around conflict resolution, so working with various different groups in, for example, the Middle East, we have to build a future first, which is around building commonality, building trust, dare I say, even trying to build friendship.
Well, I was going to say, I think one of the key benefits that a graphic facilitator brings to that conversation is because the work that we do at Innovation Arts does deal so much in future state visioning. What the graphic facilitator really brings to that is being able to make a picture of it. And I think essentially that's what we're doing as graphic facilitators, is providing that future vision. I think, a lot of times there's issues in the past that are all bound up in the context of what brought them to our door. But what we do as facilitators is try to pull them out of the past and get them into the future. Like being able to present that credible future is part of our job.
Wow, we've covered such a broad spectrum. I was so excited to secure you for the interview for our audience because the work you do is world-class. The impact you have is deep. And it's all because of you bringing to life the power of systemic listening for individuals, for teams, and for organisations and the ecosystems and stakeholders they deal with inside and outside their organisations. To Sarah and to David, thank you, and I really enjoyed listening.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Escuchando profondamente.
L'écoute profonde.
In my work with organisations, I always make a distinction between the three perspectives of listening. Listening as an individual, listening as teams, and then systemic listening, how organisations listen to others inside their organisation and those that they serve outside their organisation. What struck me most in our conversation with Sarah and with David is the power of systemic listening and their ability to bring a meaningful approach to those in the room, whether it's 550 or 500, to make sense of very complex issues in a simple visual artefact. This is a powerful tool that I've seen work well in the organisations that I consult to, not only because it helps the people in the room at that time make sense of what's being said, gives everybody an opportunity to listen, but most importantly, it lets the people in the room hear what they've said and what everybody else has said. There is great power in systemic listening, and one of the ways to bring that to life is through the visual artefacts. I think David and Sarah's work is quite extraordinary. It's world class, and I was really excited to have them as part of this podcast. For you as an individual, ask the question, are you listening completely to the person's story, as David and Sarah did in their examples with organisations? Listen completely without judgment, listen completely with empathy, and that will help you become a deeper listener.
Deep listening.
Whakarongo hohonu.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
الاستماع العميق.
L'écoute profonde.
Deep listening, impact beyond words.